Well, it's funny how things go. In the 1980s, I was in business school getting ready to graduate. I'm married. Life revolved around work, school, and us. Rather, life revolved around me. It was about career, income, fun, and more fun. It's funny how things go. I was empty. My marriage was fine. My schooling was fine. My income, though I wasn't rich, was fine. My fun was fine, but I wasn't. Something was missing. As Blaise Pascal once said, every human being is born with a God-shaped hole in their heart. And as human beings, we've been trying to fill that hole with everything but God. And we are miserable people because of it. It's funny how things go. Out of the blue, I was asked to volunteer for a church youth group, and I unexpectedly said yes. I remember showing up the night the youth group met. I was energized. I loved the energy. I loved the fun, the laughter, the relationships. I was inspired by the strength of the students, many who were living in difficult circumstances. I'd always been comfortable speaking in front of people. In fact, speaking too much had always gotten me in trouble growing up. But when I was asked to speak to students, I was nervous because I was going to be representing God. But I spoke anyway. My first sermon was on how we hide our hurts and our sins and our wounds, our fears, and when we hide them, it only hurts us. I talked about how God wants us to confess those things, bring them to the light, and when we do, He lifts that burden off of us, sets us free, and gives us new life. That's the first sermon I ever gave. Side note, my illustration on that sermon was about a kindergartner who loved to eat crayons, and he thought he could get away with it. He would eat crayons, and then the teacher would say, "Are you eating crayons?" And he'd smile, saying, "No, I'm not eating crayons," with crayons all in his teeth. So my first sermon ever, I ate crayons. I am a brilliant, brilliant man. When I was done with the talk, I saw the way the students became vulnerable to opening their lives to God, and I was hooked. The God-shaped hole began filling up. It's funny how things go. When I was in kindergarten, I was put in speech class because I only grunted and mumbled. The teacher found out I didn't have a speech problem, but I had an older sister problem, 2 of them. They always spoke for me, so I had to learn to speak for myself. And as I shared earlier, I quickly made up for lost time. Long story short, I became a youth pastor and had the time of my life. The youth group grew. We had snow camps, summer camps, scavenger hunts, prayer meetings at school campuses. Kids who did not know Jesus were making commitments to follow Jesus. My brother led worship. We ran our services like the David Letterman show. We had skits, top 10 lists, surprise guests. We even had the number to the payphone at the local Kmart. And during the service, we would call, and if someone answered, we would tell them we had a free gift if they would come down to the church. And a couple of times, they came down to the church. I love the way we could have fun one moment, laughing and being silly, and then the next moment, be in deep worship and deep reflection. It's funny how things go. I found my calling. One time I told every student to bring a friend who did not know God, and I told them I would do my best. If you bring a friend, I will do my best to present the gospel the clearest way I know how. The students did not let me down. They brought so many students, and I presented the gospel. Many responded. One man, his name was Ron, gave his life to Christ that night. He was a junior in high school. He went home and told his dad, and his dad got angry and said, "I'd rather you be out partying all weekend than going to church on Sunday." He was kicked out of his home for serving Jesus, and he lived with a family, one of our high school leaders, until he graduated. Today, Ron lives in the Bay Area, passionately serving God. Doesn't get any better than that. It's funny how things go. I was having the time of my life, but I began to have a stirring in my heart. I saw young people with deep life challenges, and many of those challenges originated in their families. I realized that in order for us to truly help young people, then it would be wise to invest and serve entire families. When marriages are strengthened and parenting is found on biblical principles, in short, when adults are doing well spiritually, it has a tremendous positive effect on their children. But there wasn't a church in the area that was reaching out and helping adults. It's funny how things go. I swore I would never be a senior pastor. The model of a senior pastor growing up was that you would come to a church for 2 or 3 years, burn out, and leave with lots of politics and arguments. This was not going to be my calling. So I continued to work with youth and started traveling, speaking at youth camps, and that opened up avenues to start speaking at adult churches around the country. This was the most difficult educational and pivotal season of my ministry life. I met a lot of inspiring people while traveling, but I also saw the underbelly of the American church with all its flaws and shortcomings. More glitz than substance, more judgment than mercy. It was also a difficult time because I had a 3-year-old and a brand new baby at home, and I was gone a lot, and it was tough. It's funny how things go. On my many long airplane flights and in lonely hotel rooms, God began to stir my heart about what would it look like in my own community where I was youth pastoring, was Placerville, California. What would it look like to have a church that could reach the entire family? I'm on a long plane flight home one day, weary, tired, missing my family. My sister is dying of cancer, and I'm reading a book on prayer, and I come to a line: the church is the hope of the world when it's working right. Church is the hope of the world when it's working right. And on that plane, tears filled my eyes and hope filled my heart. God was saying, hey, I want to build a church in Placerville that will be the hope of the world. But how was that going to happen? Well, it's funny how things go. The last week of 1993, I was asked to be an interim pastor at the church in Placerville I was youth pastoring at. The adult church was struggling, a church that might have to be sold, its property, to pay its bills, a church that had lost its mission to serve its community, a church that had divided 3 times in the last 6 years. This church was asking me, a person who said he would never be a senior pastor, if I would be willing to fill in for 6 months while they looked for a more seasoned, experienced pastor. It's funny how things go. I said yes. And in those first 6 months, we began to create a safe place for people. People who had given up on church were walking through the doors. And the kids from my youth group and their parents were showing up together. After 6 months, I was asked to stay on as the permanent senior pastor. It's funny how things go. Over the years, I was at Green Valley. That's the name of the church. When I was at Green Valley, we truly tried our best to live out the true fast of Isaiah 58, the fast those children read about. We sponsored a few thousand children through Compassion International. We built a 20,000 square foot organic garden, dozens of volunteers led by no other than Steve. Oh, this Steve right here. Steve and Lori Baker. Led by Steve. This Steve. Steve, stand up. No, stay seated. Dozens of volunteers fix cars for single moms and senior citizens. A funeral ministry helping families grieve. We partnered with the local FBI, acquiring thousands of backpacks and gift cards to give to young girls rescued from sex trafficking. We helped start a sex trafficking rescue home in New Delhi, India. We started a ministry called Taking It to the Streets, where we would help the elderly fixing their roofs, decks, and wheelchair ramps. We started a No Orphan Left Behind ministry where we supported the local foster care system and families. We fed families in the garbage dumps of Mexico, invested in pastors and church leaders in the poorest country in the world, Niger, Africa. And I could go on and on and on. And I'm not bragging. This is to God be the glory. This is what happens when you try, not perfectly, to live out the true fast of Isaiah chapter 58. I do want to give glory to the hundreds of volunteers that made all of that happen. God did some amazing things over those years. I came for 6 months, and I was there for 24 years. I'm a hard guy to get rid of. I came to the conclusion, the church is the hope of the world when it's working right. But it's funny how things go. The pace of my life kept going faster, hopping on planes at the last minute to support a flood-devastated community in West Africa, speaking to nonprofits, speaking in the community. I was the assistant chaplain for the Sacramento Kings. Life was good, but life was very busy. But emotionally And spiritually, I was running on empty. I just didn't know it. I didn't realize it at the time. I want to put this on the screen. Great things can be happening all around you, even to you, while your soul is shrinking. I began to disappear relationally. My spiritual life was on autopilot, my soul numb. I reached out to a few people I thought I could be vulnerable with, but they didn't know how to help me. I look back and I actually had neglected the relationships that could have helped me. People who loved me not for my titles or my achievements, but just for me. I took a sabbatical. Even that was hard to get approved. People kept telling me they wanted the old Ken back. But I didn't want the old Ken back. I needed a new Ken, a new view. I needed to regain my real identity, my identity given by God. As author Paul Colo says, maybe the journey is about unbecoming everything that isn't really you, so you can be who you were meant to be in the first place. That was my journey, but I didn't know how to get there. It's funny how things go. On my sabbatical, I read a book by Henry Nouwen called In the Name of Jesus, Reflections on Christian Leadership. It's a small little book. Henry Nouwen, who had left a prestigious position as a spiritual leader at Harvard University to go work at Daybreak L'Arche community in Toronto to serve mentally and physically challenged adults living in a community they would live in the rest of their lives. Henry left all of the glamour, all his relevancy, and he began to serve people who had no idea who he was. These were people who could care less about Henry's titles or how many books he had written. And through this, Henry rediscovered his true self. As I was reading Henry's journey, I realized this was a journey I would need to take. These were the three things he challenged. He says, as Christian leaders in the 21st century, three things you need to move from and towards. He says you need to move from needing to be relevant to simplistic serving. You need to move from popularity to anonymity. And maybe the most important one, you need to move from leading to being led. Needing to be relevant. Well, you know, needing to be relevant has a lot to do with ego. I mean, we may not call it ego, but we want people to see us on the cutting edge, the best, the smartest, the most competent. But sometimes trying to be relevant like that makes us miss out on the simplicity of the gospel. I knew at that point I needed to get back to simplistic serving, the simplicity of loving my neighbor, loving my enemy, to feed, shelter, give a drink, visit the sick, the imprisoned, which is the standard of how Jesus judges a Christian. I knew I needed to get back to the simplicity of the prophet Micah's requirements to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So I resigned my position after 24 years. It's funny how things go when the titles go away, how quickly you become invisible. I was no longer relevant, which hurt my feelings at first. You know, come on, 25 years of service, how could they forget me? Again, that's ego. But then that forgetfulness and that invisibility quickly became liberating. Which brought me to the second thing Henry challenged with Christian leaders, that we need to move from popularity to anonymity. I began to love being anonymous. I loved walking into restaurants, sports bars, coffee shops, and grocery stores, and no one knew who I was. It was liberating. The anonymity allowed me to get to know people with no titles or strings attached. I could listen to people, I could serve people, I could give wisdom. It was liberating and more powerful. Now, I'm not ashamed of my title, but sometimes my title gets in the way. But I think the biggest challenge and the most liberating thing for me was the third thing Henry challenged Christian leaders to do. And that was from leading to being led. That's a tough one, because I have the spiritual gift of leadership. The Apostle Paul says, if you've got the spiritual gift of leadership, lead. I mean, I love reading biographies about great leaders. It's in me. From a small child, put me in a classroom, put me on the playground. Eventually, I'll become one of the leaders. It's in me. That's how God made me, and it has served me well. But I had forgotten that in order to be a great leader, I must be willing to be led. It's funny how things go during that time of irrelevance, anonymity. Without titles, prestige, popularity, I learned, or maybe I relearned how to be a follower of Jesus. That's all he wants. That's all I need. And with that came great freedom. God began, interestingly, to rebirth what he had made me from the beginning. He began to rebirth a new stirring, something that goes deeper, that I can't escape. When I walked away from trying to be relevant, popular, when I began to be led, a rebirth happened that God had given me from the beginning. And from the beginning, the passion that I will not apologize is that God is a God who cares about the poor. I don't care. Anybody can argue anything, but I will never agree anything else except that God is a God for the poor. So I began to ask, well, what do I do with this? What am I going to do with the second part of my leadership life? Maybe my leadership life is over. But either way, I need to get back to serving the poor. Well, first of all, I needed time to heal, and I did. I needed time to remain anonymous and irrelevant and to be led to serve without leading, and I needed that time. But it's funny how things go. My brother moved back from the East Coast in 2019, and he and I began to talk about what would a church look like if it was just simple. Simple, no bells and whistles, not trying to be relevant, a safe place for people from all walks of life, from all challenges of life, for all people who could walk in and feel loved. What would a church look like that was full of servants who served their neighbor, who served one another, who served the poor? A church that emphasized joy and fun, and I emphasize fun, laughter, healing, true community, where Jesus is glorified. A church known for banquets and celebrations and parties. A church that would be desperately committed to serving the poor. A church that would actually be good news to people inside the four walls and outside the four walls. We began to meet with a few other leaders. Mike McGuire, my newfound friend, one of those friends you can share anything with and he will have your back. The kind of friend who, if I killed someone, he would help me hide the body. But because he's truly a friend, he would also make me turn myself into the police. Mike lives out the gospel, walking alongside people who are going through deep brokenness. We also begin to meet with Ron and Ginger Jacob, two friends I should have gone to when I was burning out, but I didn't. Ginger and I have a beautiful history of working together and serving the poor. The five of us begin to ask what a church would look like with simple, effective, reflective worship. A church where the messages would be practical and hope-filled, focused on the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And we begin to get more and more excited about the possibility. And then COVID hit. And we didn't have a building. So we decided to put a service online and see if people would watch it. On June 7th, 2020, right smack dab in the middle of a pandemic, we started our first online service. I want to show you a picture. That's me in the park. That's me in the park. We didn't have a building, so our first message, my first message we recorded in a public park. And I remember there was a homeless man sitting behind the camera watching me speak, and these two moms came by with strollers talking really out loud. And the homeless guy was really focused in on my message, and they were bothering him, so he turned and he yelled, "Quiet on the set!" And he became our security guard while we were doing that. I have so many great memories of recording like here in the house, in homes, and in parks. You know what? After that Sunday, we found out hundreds and hundreds had watched the service, and we were blown away. It's funny how things go. On another hand, one of the things we said is we're not going to reinvent the wheel and try to create our own stuff. That's trying to be relevant. That's trying to have an identity. We said we would not reinvent the wheel as a church. We would partner with amazing organizations, and boy, have we. Amazing organizations like World Vision, World Relief, Growing Past Today, Orangeville Fair Oaks Food Bank, Powerhouse Ministries. What a gift, what a privilege to walk and go to the front lines with these organizations that care so desperately about the poor. We eventually found this little theater. Many of you are sitting in it today. Others are watching still online. And now we're meeting in this little building here. We started our first physical service in September 2021, and this September will be our 2-year anniversary of being in this building, while we still have hundreds watching online. Oh, it's funny how things go. I spent all this time to get to this point. I tell you this whole story because it's important you know my journey. If you're going to come to church, probably good you know my journey. For those of you who are new, I wanted you to know not only my journey, but our journey. Our goal, and we are committed to this, is to keep this a safe, simple, and servant-focused church and continue to partner with amazing organizations. And I hope you come and join us, because we believe this. We believe, if you strip it all down, we believe this. Jesus is the answer for you and for I and for this broken world. That's it. I also want you to know I take very seriously, and I'm humbled that I get to speak to you each week. I'm grateful for our leadership team and the pace this church allows me to spend quality time wrestling with God, wrestling with myself as I prepare these messages. I won't always get it right. Maybe not every message will land, but friends, I want you to know it will never be because of lack of effort. I pray, I listen, I observe. A lot of these messages come out of my own life. I am 58 years old. I know. I look 28. I know. But I'm 58. I've got some life experiences, but I listen to your life experiences too, because some of you are older than me. I only have so many Sundays a year to speak to you. So I'll always revert back to hope, to the great command to love God and to love our neighbor, to the life and teachings of Jesus. Our church is named after Isaiah chapter 58. Which is about serving the poor. It's the true fast. People ask, your church is named Live 58. Is it Live 58 or is it Live 58? And I say, correct. Correct. You're both correct. We want to live out Isaiah 58 and we want to be alive while we're doing it. So it doesn't matter. Either way. Either way. You know, as these children read earlier, 3/4 of Isaiah 58 is about the blessings God promises to us if we stop trying to be relevant, stop trying to be popular, and we're led by the Spirit. We're led by the Spirit to serve the poor. I just want you to know, I don't take this lightly, and I am grateful every day. Every Sunday is a moment where we have the chance to encourage one another, which leads to miracles. I love, as Hebrews says, let's see how inventive we can be in encouraging love and helping out, not avoiding worship together. That was happening during COVID, a lot of avoiding. But we're back, spurring each other on. I do know this. I know if we stay safe, simple, and servant-focused, I know that God will walk with us. I know if I can retain some anonymity, if I can serve quietly, though I'm not a quiet guy, for those of you that serve at the food bank, you know that. But if I can continue to be led rather than always leading, the best days are ahead. And I also know this, and listen very carefully. There are people all around this little building, in the neighborhoods that exist and the new neighborhoods that are being built, that need to know about the love of God. And they need to meet you, because your love is contagious. I believe God has put us here for such a time as this. Well, you know, it's funny how things go. You may be saying, Ken, you really do talk about the poor a lot. It's because that's where Jesus says we will meet him. As Bono says, God is in the slums and the cardboard boxes where the poor play house. God is in the silence of a mother who's infected her child with a virus that will end both their lives. God is in the cries heard under the rubble of war, and God is in the debris of wasted opportunity in lives. And God is with us if we are with them. And something very paradoxical has happened in my 58 years of living. And this is what I have found out. That when you bless the poor, the poor end up blessing you. Let me close with a story. It's funny how things go. In 1994, I took a team of 30 people to Mexico City for 8 days to work with children living in extreme poverty. In a city of 30 million people, the chaos, the poverty, the smells are overwhelming. We saw children who were hungry and had nothing, yet their smiles and their thankfulness in their little voices was a strange juxtaposition for a middle-class guy like me to wrap my brain around. We'd tell them Jesus loved them, and they would say, I know. With very little, these kids had a depth to their contentment that made me envious. It magnified the depth of my emptiness. My emotional state went hurling over the edge of insanity when we spent an entire day in the vast garbage dumps on the west side of the city. We arrived at this little village which had been built up out of garbage for years. Children were all around. It seemed like we were on another planet, like the Mel Gibson movie Road Warrior. It's the only way I can explain it. Live electrical wires were lying on the ground, just waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. None of the kids knew there was a world outside of the dump. They were just grateful we were there. And all we had was rice and beans. But somebody cared. As we handed out food, a little graveyard across the way filled with little crosses marked the lives of the young who surrendered to the enemy of hunger and disease much too early. Reality sucker punched me that day. That night in my hotel room, I wept with sadness and yelled at God with anger. Questions raced through my mind. Why would God put those kids in this situation? Why doesn't God do something about it? Why doesn't somebody do something about it? Well, the next night we went to church. We went to a church service on the outskirts of the dump. The building was made out of material from the dump. All kinds of metal, plastic, and wood formed this little shack of worship. And my emotions were still raw. And then they asked me to speak. How do you speak about the hope of God when all you see is hopelessness all around you? During the music time, I watched people who had less than nothing celebrating life, singing, celebrating God, singing the Spanish words of the psalmist, "Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His love endures forever." What were they thankful for? Obviously, it wasn't because of material possessions or career dreams or because their 401k plans were growing. It came from something much deeper. It was something I needed. They were living out the words of the Apostle Paul. I've learned to be content in all circumstances. To shake my reality even more, they took an offering and gave it to us. We were not going to accept it, but our guide for the week said, you better take it or they'll be insulted. The joy on their faces was palpable as they handed the little bag of money to us. And I was reminded of the words of Paul writing about the poor churches in Macedonia. This is a powerful statement. He wrote, they are being tested by many troubles, and they're very poor. Troubles and poor for these churches in Macedonia. He says, but they're also filled with abundant joy, which has overflowed in rich generosity. When you think of the words poor and troubles, you don't associate it with the words joy and generosity. But in God's kingdom, those words go together. This poor church was contagious with abundant joy, which led to rich generosity. Well, I share that story because I came to Mexico City to help poor children, and what I discovered were joy-filled, generous children who were feeding my poor and empty soul. I hope I helped fill their hungry bellies, but I know they helped fill my hungry soul. It's funny how things go. My goal, our goal, is to continue to move from needing to be relevant to simplistic serving, to move from popularity to anonymity, and to move from leading to be led to places that will, in the end, feed our hungry souls. God bless, and thanks for letting me share.